particular, this government has made massive cuts in specific grants, including particularly area-based grants, which gave areas like Wirral, with pockets of high deprivation, additional money to reflect a higher level of need. Many observers believe that there is also a political dimension to these cuts. For example, it's difficult to believe that it's merely coincidence that Labour-run councils on average suffer cuts of more than £107 per head, compared with Tory authority cuts of £36 per head, and Liberal Democrat councils of just £38 per head. In the light of the weight of evidence, Mr Mayor, that the government's cuts programme is unfair, it's not surprising that groups such as faith leaders, particularly people like Bishop of Liverpool, are calling for a change of direction by the government. Mr Mayor, I recently attended a conference in Liverpool of council and faith leaders from some of the core cities and Merseyside districts, where we heard reports of the impact of cuts in council funding in those core cities and the real concern about the consequences of huge cuts in local services, together with the impact of the bedroom tax, universal credit and other welfare benefit cuts. The motion I'm moving on behalf of the Labour Group calls on the Council to support the Come Together campaign launched by faith and council leaders on the 18th of January, and to encourage people to sign the online petition which has been launched, which calls on the government to apply the cuts more fairly across the country. Not only are we facing huge cuts by central government in our grants and a failure to fund our demographic growth, we've also, as we know, have to address a number of exceptional items, which next year total around 38 million on top of the 39 million of cuts. We need to make the case to the government that it's unreasonable to expect this council to deliver 77 million savings in 1 year. Mr Mayor, it's time to say enough is enough. Let's make our voice heard with government and demand a fair deal for Wirral. Thank
you. Councillor Brickhouse. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There are two parts to my amendment. And the first is, in spite of what we've just heard, the first is quite complex because and the second is quite simple. So the first concerns local government finance. And that's always something that keeps us awake at night. And many of you, I know, will have taken the view that, well, my mind's made up, so please don't confuse me with the facts. Nevertheless, perhaps rather foolishly, just allow me to, perhaps as much as I can, to put a non-political steer on the way the government distributes money to local authorities. On balance, since 2009-10, the funding that has been distributed to local authorities has been distributed in an uneven fashion. There is no dispute about that. Mind you, and if you look now, the latest 2013-14, and you look, I was reading the complaints that are coming from some of the Shire counties, I think the pain is actually starting to hurt right across the board. But there are a number of reasons as to why, perhaps a little bit complex, but nevertheless, there are a number of reasons why that we've seen this narrowing of the differential between some of the more affluent areas and some of the more deprived areas. I'll just suggest to you three reasons why this narrowing has taken place. Firstly, we go back, and I'm starting in 2009-10. In those wonderful days when Gordon Brown was in number 10, and just before the election, surprise, surprise, yes, he did give quite a number of specific ring-fence grants to local authorities, many of which went to metropolitan boroughs. They were always intended to be only for 1 or 2 years. In fact, he used that wonderful phrase of saying, in future I'm going to give local authorities more opportunity, more choice in how they spend the money, which we know from Eric Pickles is now a euphemism for saying, I'm going to cut your funding in future and you can make those hard decisions. So yes, that did happen in 2009-10. And then, secondly, this government, and I any increase. Unfortunately, or otherwise, if you do try to freeze the council tax, you do have to give more money to those parts of the country that tend to pay more council tax. And thirdly, perhaps I should remind you what Tony Travers told us at the Floral Pavilion. More and more, as the years go by, councils spend a greater proportion of their spending on social services. And social services costs are very often the same right across the country. In fact, we think it's expensive to put somebody into residential care on Merseyside, but the cost of putting somebody into residential care in the south of England is even far greater than it is up here. So all those factors, and there are others, because education has been frozen and that tends to be fairly even across the country, whereas and is less affected by levels of deprivation. All those have contributed to a reduction in the differential. But let's not forget for one moment that even after all that, the 10% most deprived councils in this country will spend something like 75% more per head than the 10% with the lowest spending, most affluent parts of the country. And if you really want to look at this, I know reference was made to the reductions in Hackney, but it still remains the case that the councils that are the most highest spending are the inner London boroughs. And you might just ask, why is that the case? And that brings me to my second part. The second part is, it's quite simple, which we need to continue to maintain our dialogue with central government. And we need to do this not so that we can go along with the begging bill, not so that we can go along and tell them that we have got a problem in our finances of 77 million. In fact, I can imagine, I don't know what happened when we went a few weeks ago, but I imagine when we left, they closed the door and they said, oh, we got away with that one. We've only reduced the grant to Wirral by 15 million. They've got 77 million now. We've 77 million problem. Well, we won't get the blame for that. No, that's not the reason we need to maintain the dialogue. We need to maintain the dialogue because of the special circumstances that do affect Wirral. There will be, following initiatives like Michael Heseltine's review of city regions, there will be additional funding coming to Merseyside, and we do need to ensure that we get our share. There's a clear danger, given our geographical position, that we will lose out. We are, after all, the second highest local authority for the number of residents that live in the borough but work outside. Geography dictates that we will remain a place to live, if not to work. So, let's make sure, let's be absolutely practical, that we do get the funding that recognises that position. So, for example, anyone who is thinking of coming to live on the Wirral, drives through the Mersey Tunnel, pays £1.60, and then has the misfortune to drive up Borough Road, has to pass derelict properties next to the library. We've been talking about demolishing those properties for the last 10 years. Similarly, this council, we heard earlier about Kate Wood, been on the council since it started.
Okay, have your turn. Okay. Right, carry on.
Similarly, we've been talking about making commuting easier by electrifying the Brixton to Wrexham line for about the last 40 years. So these are the reasons why we need to keep talking to Westminster, the Welsh Assembly, and whatever it takes to make sure that Wirral is not forgotten. So let's be positive about what we're doing, and let's put Wirral on the map. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other speakers? Who we got here? Yes. You're good self first, Councillor. You're good. You're first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been listening very carefully to what the Leader of Council outside the UK. So there are a whole host of factors that might get written into the various calculations. Now, the Bishop of Liverpool has been mentioned courteously by the leader of the council. So I looked at the question that the Bishop asked in the House of Lords on the 23rd of January. He asked for a greater allowance for highest levels of deprivations in both rural and urban areas. There was a comment from Baroness Hannam I'll come back to, and in particular Lord Harris of Haringey, who I follow, asked particularly, did ministers change the formula for distribution so as to produce a result whereby the most deprived areas are losing the most? That's the key question that was asked. Baroness Hannam says, my lords, the formula has not been, as been suggested, tinkered with. Now, I'm happy to sit down with the leader and other representatives and look at specific things that we can argue our case on behalf of Wirral. I looked at the leader's letter from last November, which set up the meeting with the government. In particular, I'm paraphrasing it, but it said we don't want to be rewarded for our bad budgets, but there are a number of specific things we want help with, capitalisation being one of them. So I'm quite happy to look at those aspects. But what I do find trouble with is the impression that it would all be different somehow if the government weren't there. And for that evidence, I looked at a recent article by Laura Wilkes, who works for the Local Government Information Unit. And what she said, with the coalition having passed its midway point, councils will be thinking about whether a future Labour government might be able to give local authorities a better deal. Now, she works with an LGRU, and she ought to know what's going on. She says, but we already know that restoring public spending to the levels before the 2010 election is just not possible. There simply isn't the money that there once was. Now, that is the key...
Councillor Gilchrist, your time is up. Councillor Grassland.
Numerous times people have said to me these council meetings are close to meaningless. A lot of noise and bluster, which achieves almost nothing, a bit like Bruce Springsteen's Jungle Land. However, as Mark said, the point is to change it. This motion calls attention to the inequality of the cuts to local authority budgets being imposed on councils with high levels of deprivation, which previous governments have recognised by awarding higher revenue support grants. This government is imposing the biggest cuts on these authorities, thereby ensuring the least able to pay are paying the highest marginal costs to support a government policy driven by the laughable notion we are all in this together and designed to fix a budget situation which has arisen as a result of greedy city bankers and international financiers. Some of you will be aware that a couple of us have visited South Africa recently. Everywhere we went, we saw signs saying, not to feed baboons. We wondered why anyone would want to. They looked a bit scary. Once we came upon a sign which said, baboons are dangerous wild animals. Baboons which have been fed by humans become aggressive and have to be destroyed. But what about life from the baboon's perspective? Walking on your knuckles, hunted by dogs. Does a baboon suppose the next baboon is going to steal the food from its mouth, or will it kill it first to save the bother later, and then steal the food? I suggest baboons make zero-sum calculations. Humans have the capacity to make more sophisticated distinctions. In 2011, Petra Ecclestone spent £11 million on her wedding. At the time, in answer to criticism her mother said she didn't care how much the wedding had cost. It was a once-in-a-lifetime day. Who cares about money anyway? This is a story from that hotbed of socialism, the Daily Mail. I suppose they think the untermenschen have my big fat gypsy wedding on telly to console them. At last week's Cabinet, the Director of Adult Social Services reported the proposed increase for the cost of care home provision in the coming budget will be £1,065,000 for the year. In other words, Petra's wedding could have paid for the increase of costs of care for this year for the next 10 years. At last week's area forum, a member of the public asked Tories opposite what they had said on behalf of Wirral's beleaguered population when they met Eric Pickles a couple of weeks ago and the cuts to services they were being asked to accept. They had to admit they hadn't said anything on the subject of unfairness at all. I would ask the humans opposite how they can defend a government that offers tax cuts to millionairesses to spend on increasing their £500,000 shoe collection, while the most vulnerable on Wirral lose out to support them. And live down to what are you thinking? Of course, Nelson Mandela is a South African, but I hadn't realised he is also an Egyptian. At his inauguration, he said this: "We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? Your playing small doesn't serve you well." Nietzsche put it this way: "Well then, if you can't be a great man, be as great a man as you can be. In this way, lift men up above themselves and make a space for genius in the world." Mandela puts it more poetically: "As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others." This was the real significance of Councillor Johnston's stance on the permanent appointment of the Chief Executive. We humans can be liberated and support the motion and make a difference. Mr. Mayor, they say travel broadens the mind. I support the motion.
Councillor Gregson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I never thought I'd be starting to make a speech off with the word poppycock. But there you have it. These cuts are more to do with a political ideology against ordinary working people than what they are to do with any form of efficiency or austerity. The hidden working class people are lending breath to this country, mostly in the northwest, with the exception of a few small pockets of clusters down in London. These cuts are not, as it says in the amendment, a product of what's gone on over the years. These cuts are a product of these governments in the last 2.5 years. They've brought them out, they've identified their targets, and they've brought them in to target them deliberately. I think, to be honest, our time would be best spent from the members on the other side of the floor of both parties would be for them to actually approach the government themselves and say, this is what you're doing to our constituents, these are the effects, and this is the mess we're going to have to clear up when you're finished. Because what these cuts are going to lead to, they're going to lead to an increase in social deprivation. We've already got the food banks now. Where's it going to end? This is something that's coming out of the coalition that we, including you in the future, are going to have to clear up. It's your constituents that are going to suffer from this. It's your constituents that are going to be facing the bedroom tax. You've heard a lot of mention tonight about religious groups, our spiritual leaders, etc. I'll give you the quote today from the Archbishop of Motherwell, who actually made a comparison between David Cameron and Nero. Will's burning, and he's fiddling. So I support this motion. I'm against the amendment. Thank you very much.